So in this video, I wanted to talk about the Haijin policy, which, for those that don't know, it was a policy adopted by the Ming and Qing dynasties of China, but also had like precedents in previous Chinese dynasties. But basically the Haijin policy put a very severe, essentially almost banned all trade with outside like foreign countries, or specifically on the coast of China in the southeast, in places like Guangzhou, Fujian, the area around Nanjing and Shanghai, these places that are prime areas for overseas trade. The Haijin policy tried to lock down trade in those areas and was also essentially the cause of the Opium War, one of the causes where the British really did not like that policy. And a lot of people point to this Haijin policy, as having been one of the reasons why China didn't modernize like with Europe, or had to like go through the century of humiliation where they had to suddenly accept all of these ideas from Europe. Whereas if you look at other countries like in the Ottoman Empire or India or even Iran, even in like the early 1800s and even 1700s, the states in these states were able to see what the Europeans were doing, and especially in the military sphere, adopted a lot of ideas from them, as well as some aspects of political philosophy, although this intensified in the later 1800s and especially the early 1900s. And so with the disastrous effects of the Haijin policy, right, which was slowing down modernization, reducing economic growth in China's coast, and also reducing revenues for the Ming and Qing dynasties from losing all of that foreign trade. Or there was still foreign trade, but it was heavily restricted with intense government oversight, and monopolies being granted to specific merchants, or everything just being handled by government officials. And even then, I believe there were quotas on how much goods could flow into China and all that. And so people ask, why was this policy maintained despite all of the obvious downsides that would have been visible to these dynasties? And something I really hate is people just say, oh, that was just the Chinese mindset, and this is an approach that is always dangerous in fields like history, where like it's like the equivalent of saying, why was the Roman Empire so big? Oh, the Romans just like to conquer. Like it's just such a shallow explanation, and it ignores all of the different factors that caused states like Rome or the Ming or Qing dynasties to exist, and completely ignores all the use in history in looking at them and applying what we've learned to the modern day. Right, like Rome was surrounded by essentially like the Diadochi, the states that established were falling apart. Rome won the War of Carthage. It was in a prime position in the Mediterranean to exploit the trade. It had vast manpower and a pretty good bureaucracy for the standards of the time, as well as a pretty efficient political system and a very good military. Like, there are all of these factors that are just thrown away when you say, oh, it was just their culture. And I'm not saying that one should not consider the zeitgeist of historical eras that they study. I'm just saying it's generally overblown. And so if you look at the history of China, right? Why did the Ming and Qing pursue such like anti-commercial policies? And these were like policies like also kind of done by previous Chinese dynasties. And the reason these dynasties had done such things is that, there was fear that, and not just fear, like well-founded fear, and I believe there are examples of this, of merchants inflating prices, especially in hard times, right? Whenever a famine happened in China, generally the government response was to distribute stockpiles of grain at a low or even no price. But in times of famine, right, like supply contracts, so the merchants increase prices. So merchants, and like all private industry, naturally conflicts with government plans and generally protests like government policies. So they just got in the way of Chinese central governments. They could cause problems for like the poor who would also, or the peasantry who would also often blame problems on these merchants. They also, as they do in the modern world, merchants often collaborated with local government and could increase corruption. It was also like the way it was seen, the merchants were just acting as an unnecessary middleman between the peasantry and society, which was headed by the government. Right, merchants were seen as inflating prices and just causing trouble. And notably, I believe in the Tang and Song dynasties, the government specifically made policies where they themselves would like set up their own like bureaus that kind of acted as merchants and tried to like compete with the merchants. Um, and so merchants were kind of just seen as pointless. But when we look at a dynasty that did encourage trade both overland and overseas, that being the Yuan dynasty, um, notably one of the less Sinicized dynasties of China, we see that, for example, the overseas trade brought in a lot of foreigners to the Chinese coast, and this even resulted in a rebellion by mainly Persian Muslims, which actually devolved in Fujian of all places, in I believe Fuzhou was it? Right, there was an uprising by mainly Muslim merchants. Although then they then descended. Interestingly, they descended into infighting, and which was partially motivated by them being of Sunni and Shia orientation. So that's very interesting. But it shows that like letting in all of these overseas merchants could also provide source of discontent, as and you can see throughout history how is such as in the 1905 or 1906 Persian constitutional revolution, which one of the main interest groups in that were the merchants. And in a lot of revolutions throughout history, merchants often are the ones that first start start a political movement, and even if they did not start it, they're the ones that financially support it, like an insurrectionary political movement, and are also often the ones that pay for the newspapers and stuff to distribute the essentially like dissident ideas and mobilize the populace, and also actually fund the armies and insurgencies and stuff. So the merchants were also just in general a threat to the central government with the wealth that they had. So and additionally, the Qing and Ming especially had problems with overseas trade, where a lot of silver was exiting the Ming because their citizens were importing a lot of Spanish goods, and there's a lot of evidence of trade between the Spanish Empire, especially through like the Philippines, and the Ming Dynasty, and this caused the silver value, like amount of silver in China to really drop, and this caused like a currency crisis where the government was experiencing a lot of difficulty in even paying people because they didn't really have enough silver or couldn't scrounge up enough silver from the population. And so this was one of the motivations to intensify the Haijin policy. And the Qing dynasty faced a similar problem, where they didn't want to lose their currency to other countries like the Ming had. And so the Haitian policy also addressed this issue, especially since it seems like in many ways the Ming and Qing interestingly weren't able to like export enough to make up for this imbalance. Maybe due to lacking like industrialization or whatever. So yeah. So I just made this video to really just counter the claim. This is to counter the claims that this was just because of like Chinese culture, that they believed that they were superior to the world and that trade was just a nuisance, which these were attitudes held especially by Chinese emperors, but it's not like they're blind in seeing what was going on. It's not like people, no matter their like ideologies, can at least see what's happening in front of them and acknowledge the statistics. Right, like even someone like Hitler, for example, didn't just in many ways he did underestimate his enemies, but he still was able to look at changes in the war in World War II and adjust his policy and strategy. Or and this can be like argued about, but essentially we can't just boil everything down to ideology and just culture, because that's just not useful, and also because in many ways is might not just not be true. Like that generally isn't the primary motivator in why people do things, right? You can't explain someone by just, oh, it's just the culture they come from. So yeah.